Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about the new Magus options in Tian Xia's character guide. This book is chock full, 138 pages of pretty much nothing but new player options. So we have a lot to cover, and I'm going to start off with the thing I was the most excited for, which are the two new hybrid studies. And in addition to these hybrid studies, we actually got some new feats. But before we get started with the video, I want you guys to know that Paizo did send me a copy of the PDF for the sake of reviewing the book, but this is not a sponsored video, so all thoughts and opinions here are my own. And in addition to this, if you guys are looking to help support the channel, I am partnered with Into the AM, who give me these really nice shirts. This Viking, it has some blue on it that doesn't work really well with my green screen, but as you can see here, it is a really nice like cotton fabric shirt. It's been through the wash several times at this point now, and it still fits really well, and it's still holding up pretty darn well. So I highly recommend these shirts, and a lot of you have already decided to go in and get some yourself. So you can check out my link down in the description below, where you can get 10% off on all clothes you find on the website and some other things as well. And if you want a really stellar deal, they have this thing going on right now where you can get 3 shirts for around $60, but that's not including my 10% discount. So with that, each shirt comes out to a little less than $20, which is a really good deal if you ask me personally. But let's go ahead and get to the 2 new hybrid studies found here in the Tian Xia character guide. Now, both of these hybrid studies are uncommon. That's because they come from the practice of Jingong from Tian Xia as a character option. It's up to you and your GM if your character would have access to these. Honestly, there is nothing too strong about them, so I don't see a problem with it in any of your games personally, but, you know, that's between you and your GM. But first, let's talk about Aloof Firmament. So, Aloof Firmament is very interesting, and it is kind of the flying sword style of, if you're familiar with Chinese fantasy style of stuff, it's based on, you know, like Wuya and Qinggong use of kind of supernatural forces to make yourself lighter than air. In fact, when you pick up Aloof Firmament, you get the Catfall General feat, which is really cool. In addition to this, while you're in your Arcane Cascade, you gain the benefits of the Quick Jump General feat. So you essentially get 2 general feats, though one of them only accessed through your Arcane Cascade. And whenever you fly, leap, high jump, or long jump, and this actually becomes more relevant with the feat and their conflict spell, your movement doesn't trigger reactions. If you take one of these actions, the next strike you make with a one-handed weapon in the sword group does additional damage in your Arcane Cascade. So it increases to 4 damage at base, 6 damage if you have weapon specialization, or 8 damage if you have greater weapon specialization. Now, this does require that you have nothing in your other hand. It can't even be a free hand weapon or item, which makes this another one-handed weapon style that I'm seeing very commonly throughout Pathfinder. Now, I will say, even though you get the damage bonus for one-handed weapons, I wouldn't say that Aloof Firmament is a one-handed style per se. It's just you get a special benefit if you use a one-handed weapon in the sword group. So something to consider. And it does tie into their conflict spell. So, you know, it's kind of a one-handed style, but I could see you playing it around not using a one-handed weapon if you really wanted to, because you still get the benefits of being lighter than air, essentially, being able to fly in many situations, and also just getting the Catfall General feat. Now, in order to get the benefits of the Catfall General feat, you do need to not be using a shield and are wearing either light armor or no armor. So this is a lighter style, similar to the Laughing Shadow. But in addition to this, we get a conflict spell that is Sky Laughs at Waves, and then we get the studious spells Water Walk, Wall of Wind, and Variable Gravity from the original Secrets of Magic book. So overall, some pretty decent studious spells. I would say Honestly, variable gravity is probably the better one. Water walk is okay, but there's so many ways you can get access to water walk that it's not typically one of my favorite spells. And Wall of Wind is potentially really good, but it's very situational and one of my least favorite of the wall spells. Taking a look at their conflict spell, Sky Laughs at Waves, this does require that you're wielding a one-handed weapon in the sword group, though it doesn't state specifically that your other hand is free. So as long as you're at least wielding a one-handed weapon in the sword group, you can use this. So if you're dual wielding, you can use this, which I think is very important to mention. So you fly up to your speed when you use this spell, and at the end of your movement, you make a strike. Now, you do need to end this movement next to an enemy, so you can't just use this to fly, as the spell becomes disrupted. So not a free fly at level 1, which kind of sucks, but it does make a lot of sense, and this is going to be very useful for you to get to enemies who are maybe up on some rafters or banisters or something, though you do need to be careful because at the end of the movement, after you make your strike, if you don't have any other means of flying, you're going to fall. So be careful, but overall, a pretty interesting one. And like I said, you still can use this while dual wielding, though if you do, you are missing out on some of the extra damage you could do. So, I'm just trying to look at some alternative ways because as much as I understand the balancing points around one-handed weapon builds, like I'm playing a Thaumaturge personally, and it is a one-handed class as well, I am kind of getting tired of seeing a bunch of them, so if there's any way to mix it up, I always try to do that as best as I can. Now, moving on to the Unfurling Brocade, this one is a very interesting one. So essentially, you have to use an key-infused fabric, which just becomes essentially a bladed scarf weapon. Now, you can wield this bladed scarf in a singular hand if you decide to do so, though the damage die does become a D4 rather than a D6 if you're using it in two-handed. Now, the bladed scarf weapon, which I'm just going to go ahead and show you here before we talk about the rest, is a two-handed reach weapon that has disarm, finesse, reach, sweep, and trip, which means even in the one-handed use of the weapon, even though your damage goes down, you have a massive number of traits attached to it. In addition, this is a flail weapon, which when you get their critical specialization, the enemy is knocked prone unless they make a reflex save against your class DC, which is pretty huge. Now, another really interesting thing, and this makes a lot of sense, is if you're wearing Hand Wraps of Mighty Blows, you can confer the runes you have on those to the fabric you use to make this bladed scarf, provided that those runes can apply to the bladed scarf. And you can also create this key-infused material as a part of an interact action to draw the weapon. Now, one thing that I do find a little bit curious about all this is, does this also apply to a bladed scarf? Because their focus or their conflict spell is based on using a key infused fabric. So to me, this is all kind of fun and goofy, but it doesn't really do much because you could already just use a bladed scarf. So I'm very curious if you have to use just like some fabric or if this actually can be applied to a bladed scarf. I mean, it would make sense. I would allow it personally, but I'm just curious about what their intent is with the design here. Regardless of any of that, while you're in your arcane cascade stance, the magical energy flowing through your fabric gives you some additional benefits. If you critically succeed at an athletics check to disarm your opponent, for instance, you can spend an additional action immediately afterward to flick your fabric to make the enemy drop the weapon in your space rather than their space, which is pretty cool because this is a reach weapon, so you can actually bring their weapon to you from a distance, meaning at minimum, they need to move up to you to pick up the weapon unless they have really long arms like a large creature might. Another really cool thing when you're using this is your fabric gains the grapple trait, which means you're getting a bladed scarf with another trait, which is insane, by the way. And after you successfully use an athletics check to grapple an enemy, you can spend a single action after the grapple to immediately pull the creature 5 feet to you. a very interesting option and something that I think is very cool in combat in general. Though you are spending extra actions for these things, and I'm going to talk about that here in just a moment, but that kind of rubs me the wrong way when it comes to the Magus specifically. So last but not least, while you're in your Arcane Cascade anyway, when you attempt to trip a foe using your fabric, the target can be 2 sizes larger than you rather than just 1. Now, this one is meh, because you can get Titan Wrestler that essentially will do the same thing anyway. So whatever, I guess you just don't need Titan Wrestler, but you're going to be investing so much in athletics anyway. And honestly, how many actual athletic skill feats are there that are really worth taking? So this one's kind of just a whatever to me. Now you get the Conflict spell, Home Among the Mulberry Leaves, and you get the Studious spells, Web, Whirling Scars, makes a lot of sense, and Planar Tether. So all these I think are pretty good. Web is actually pretty solid. Whirling Scarves is handy in some situations. And Planar Tether is okay. It's very specific because it only works in enemies essentially attempting to teleport away from your group at the moment. So, but not bad. And Studious spells are kind of one of the more, I think, underplayed parts of Magus. Now, the Conflict spell itself is actually really good. So it's a singular action. You must be wielding your key infused fabric, which is why I brought up the question of, can a bladed scarf be used for this? I would say it can, but whatever. Key formed threads unravel from your fabric, are conjured into needles in your hands, and you use these needles to essentially impale your enemy, causing them on success to become immobilized. Now, this is a part of a melee strike, so you get a melee strike with your weapon. If you hit, the enemy is immobilized until the start of your next turn anyway, and if they're going to escape, they must escape against your spell DC. Now, if you critically succeed, then the needles embed themselves into the nervous system of your enemy, making them your choice of either enfeebled one or clumsy one, which is really cool, though until the start of your next turn. And this says, in addition to immobilizing it, I don't know if the enemy escapes, whether they're no longer enfeebled or clumsy. That's something I really wish they had specified here, but I'm going to say, even if they do escape, their nervous system still got damaged. So at the very least, until the start of your next turn, they're probably still enfeebled or clumsy. But that's open for interpretation. So, my opinion versus your GM's, whoever's right is really just whoever's going to be more fun in the situation, right? So both of these conflict spells and both of these hybrid studies, I think, are really good, and they do add some interesting things. Now, what makes me a little uncomfortable with this is I've always had a problem with the Magus's overall action economy bulk. In order to, for instance, go into one's Arcane Cascade, you must have cast a spell before doing so. And also, they're not addressing what needs to be changed when it comes to your Arcane Cascade for damage. I know there's already an errata for that, more or less, but because the Arcane Cascade does additional damage based on the type of spell you used before, if they don't do damage, which a lot of these don't innately have a specific damage type other than what your weapon would use, it does cause some more of those kind of problems. In addition to this as well, they are just compounding on some of the issues that Magus has. For instance, for the Unfurling brocade, the additional action when you either disarm or grapple an enemy is just on top of the many actions you need as a Magus. Spell striking is your number one thing you're trying to do because it's highly damage efficient. It's so good. And I played a Magus for a really long time, and it was really hard not to just spell strike as many rounds as you could because you don't get that many rounds to spell strike typically. And it's just so hyper damage efficient. So that's already one problem as well. So it's okay, you need to cast a spell, then you go into your Arcane Cascade, and then the next turn, you probably spell strike, and then do whatever. It doesn't open itself up to use of a lot of the things here. Now, I feel like Paizo doesn't want you spell striking as often as possible, and I can see a way of playing the game where that is the thing. That's actually what I tried doing at first. but it's just so much less damage efficient. And I'm not one for like highly, efficient play styles. Like you can only play in a way that optimizes your damage. But spell striking is just one of your core aspects, so it feels like the game wants you to do that. But if you're doing something like Unfurling Brocade, they don't want you to spell strike because you can't spell strike and do any of these like actions in the same round because it requires the use of additional actions. And that's even if you manage to get into Arcane Cascade, which can sometimes just be really difficult, especially if you need to move. I mean, I'm like, cast a spell, Arcane Cascade. Hopefully it was a range spell or something. So I don't like how none of this addresses those problems, but they could, because it doesn't talk about how you get into Arcane Cascade. All Magus really needs is a free way to get into Arcane Cascade that doesn't consume an action, and I'm way happier about it. Granted, Unfurling Brocade still conflicts with Spell Strike, but at the very least, if you can get into Arcane Cascade as a free action, I feel like that alleviates some of the pressure at the very least. I'm not sure. Anyway, I just kind of want to air some of my grievances with the Magus build style, because while this all looks really cool, while the Unfurling Brocade adds some interesting options, or whether the Aloof firmament makes your character able to have like way more mobility options, those things just innately conflict with spell striking, because spell striking is essentially a 3 action activity because you need to recharge it in order to use it. And yeah, there are ways to do it for free, and you can do it as a part of using a conflict spell, but still, it doesn't really give you many options to do this stuff outside of those options. So yeah, but let's go ahead and take a look at the feats. Now, they added 2 feats, one for each, or 2 feats per hybrid study, so a total of 4 feats altogether, starting off here with Distant Waterbird's Poise. I actually really like this one. Now, this requires a Aloof Firmament hybrid study and the Spell Strike feature, so essentially you can only do this if you're a Magus. And the trigger is you hit with a Spell Strike. So when you hit with a Spell Strike, you, as a reaction, leap, high jump, long jump, and this movement doesn't trigger any reaction. So even if you're not in Arcane Cascade, you still get this benefit, which is really good. And if you use the high jump or long jump options, you also don't need to stride initially, which is essentially the effect of quick jump. So again, I like how they gave you this option that's not baked into the Arcane Cascade, so that you can get these benefits even if you haven't managed to do so. If you're starting the combat off, for instance, with a spell strike, makes a lot of sense. It's really, really good. Now, the cool thing about this one is you gain the same lightness from essentially the use of the spell strike. And after the jump, if you land on or walk on water surfaces, you can do so until the end of your next turn, as if you had water walk, which is pretty cool. So this one, I have some very interesting ideas on how to utilize this. And I think this is a really good feat, and it does solve some of my problems because it allows you to do some of the stuff like high jump, long jump, whatever, as a reaction rather than taking up some of your action economy on your turn, which makes those things work a bit better with your spell strike. And because this can be used essentially anytime you spell strike, this gives you insane mobility while you're spell striking at the cost of a reaction. So it really depends on your particular play style, but I think Distant Waterbird's Poise is an insanely good feat. Now, for Unfurling Brocade, we have Heaven Earth Encompassing Sleeves. Now, this requires that you have the Unfurling Brocade hybrid study, duh. And essentially what this just does is it gives your clothes, whatever you're wearing, sleeves of storage. This also makes your clothes more durable, giving them hardness equal to your level and hit points equal to twice your level, or increasing the amount of hit points they have. I mean, there's some situations, sure, where that might come up, and I do love the idea that you can make clothes that are genuinely really, really hard, which there are, I think, some armor feats you can use that can make some good use of this, but I'm not sure as far as the hardness is concerned anyway. But this is interesting, and at 9th level, you actually get access to greater sleeves of storage. Now, this is kind of just one of those fluff Magus feats that I would say are interesting, but they don't really have any major combat effectiveness. I like how they blend in with the class, and it gives you access to essentially a really handy item as early as level 4. I mean, like, Bag of Holding is still way better, but this is a really good alternative in the meantime. Though I always use Sleeves of Storage mostly for holding like weapons, and your weapons are your clothes in this particular style. So I would have to see what effective use people could use out of these Sleeves of Storage, but giving you essentially 2 magic items for the cost of a single class feat that you could always train out of if you feel like you're not using it. Honestly, not a terrible feat in my opinion. Now, Vermilion Threads, on the other hand, is insanely cool. So it's another reaction. This one is also for the Unfurling Brocade. Now, it requires that you're currently in Arcane Cascade to use, and the trigger is when you use Arcane Cascade. So when you go into Arcane Cascade, then you fill a 15-foot burst centered on you with threads. Now, these threads are difficult terrain, but you ignore this difficult terrain, and the strings can support your weight, allowing you to walk on them as though you're benefiting from fly, which essentially makes you fly, at least within this 15-foot burst, allowing you to get a height advantage on some enemies, do some really cool things, and because your weapon is essentially a bladed scarf, you have reach to make the most use out of this. Insanely cool. And it's a reaction based on when you use your Arcane Cascade, so it gives you some extra benefits and doesn't clutter our action economy. These are changes I really, really like. Now, if only Arcane Cascade was a free action, this would be even cooler, but then this would be, I think, really, really strong. Granted, you still need to cast a spell to go into Arcane Cascade. I don't know. We should be seeing some fixes around the Magus and the Summoner sometime, I think, this late fall season. So hopefully we'll see something on that. Anyway, there's actually more to the spell. So these webs last for a minute, but they end early if your Arcane Cascade ends or you leave the web. So it is something that you need to be cautious of. If you leave the web, that goes away and you lose the benefit, and then you'll need to go through the whole rigmarole to get another Arcane Cascade up. So something to be wary of. Now, if you cast a spell from a spell slot while on the web, the strings glow red until the beginning of your next turn, dealing damage equal to the spell's rank to any creatures other than you that moves through this web. This damage occurs after the creature's movement, which requires a basic reflex saving throw against your spell DC. A creature can take this damage only once each round. So there is something I am a little unhappy about this last part, because I think it's really, really cool. Don't get me wrong. I think the idea with the webs is so cool. It gives you extra mobility options. It's really interesting. I don't like that the damage is based on a basic reflex saving throw against your spell DC. It makes sense thematically. The enemy can flip around the webs, do whatever. But there's so many other classes that can just deal extra damage based on the use of a spell that consumes a spell slot, which is a resource. And it's not a lot of damage. The damage they're not taking by succeeding the reflex saving throw is only a handful, like, at most, which is on in a perspective not so interesting, but at the same time it's like, well, you're also only dealing an extra handful of damage if they fail. So I would have actually just made this where they just take damage equal to the spell when they move through your area, period. No basic reflex saving throw. I don't think that's particularly strong. And while this web does give you some interesting options, the counterplay to it is just to move away from the web to force you off of it. So, I feel like just allowing it to deal damage to any enemies that move through the area, like the once each round thing, is completely fine. But if they do it at least at all, I would honestly probably run this myself where they just take the damage. I feel like the basic reflex saving throw is just not necessary, and the damage being saved against is not enough of a threat to really make it. And the enemy obviously has to willingly go through the thread anyway. So I feel like it's just a little too much. Otherwise, I really, really like Vermilion Threads. I think it's really good. And again, another reaction that doesn't clutter up our action economy. So they're moving in the right direction in a lot of ways. I really hope we see some fixes with something like Arcane Cascade or at least the whole routine for Magus, because otherwise it feels like it's really rough to make use of a lot of the really cool things Magus should be able to do. Last but not least, we have Unsheathing the Sword Lights. Now, of course, this is for Aloof Firmament, and this requires you have a spell strike, and it's a 2-action spell strike. Now, your spell strike must be charged, and you're wielding a one-handed weapon in the sword group. Again, doesn't require that you're only wielding one-handed weapon, just that you have a one-handed weapon. So, you can dual wield and still do this, just saying. Now, this essentially is just a different spell strike. You use 2 actions, you make a melee spell strike with a spell that isn't a cantrip or focus spell, which does make a lot of sense, though using your cantrips is one of the best ways to use spell strike, in my opinion. And as you do so, you create countless copies of your sword that rain down around your opponent in a 10-foot emanation from the target of your spell strike. Now, this emanation does exclude you and the target from the spell strike, but everyone around the target takes damage equal to twice the spell's rank, and this damage is considered cold iron and silver. Now, this is one of the ones where it's just like, I'm perplexed by the thought that this one doesn't require a save against additional spell damage, essentially, but the threads did. Whatever. Anyway, to really emphasize why this is super good is now this is all creatures in the area, so you do have to be careful. But if you go up and fight a couple enemies, you use a spell strike, it hits the enemy and deals a bunch of damage, and because you're a bounded caster, you're upcasting your spells as much as possible, essentially. That's a good way to deal, like, even if there's one other enemy, they are going to often take probably like 10 damage at this rank anyway, at minimum, or at most, or 8 damage, which is really good. And each enemy addition to that is multiplicative, so you get a bunch of extra damage based on when you're using this. And with the conflict spell, this allows you to fly into the enemies, strike, and then you could spell strike immediately after that if you really want to. Granted, you have to worry about your map, but still, one-handed weapon could be agile and can do a lot of damage. So I gotta say, pretty good feat, honestly. And that's pretty much it for all the options for the Magus. Now, there are a variety of other classes that got some extra things, like the Inventor, for instance, or the Monk. And as well, there is a ton of really cool art ancestry options, versatile heritages added to ancestries, which is really cool. And in addition to this, some really cool archetypes like the Cultivator. So I want you guys to let me know what you want me to cover. I'm going to be doing a video every week for the next week on as much as I can cover in this game. So let me know in the comments what you want me to make videos on, and I'll target that stuff moving forward. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and thanks for listening to me kind of complain about Magus a bit. It's a class I really, really want to like, but I feel like it just is a little too clunky. Maybe you disagree, I don't know. Regardless of whether you agree or disagree, all this stuff is really cool, and I think it adds a lot of new flavor and interesting things to the Magus, which has been a bit bone dry as far as new character options since its initial release. So yeah, I'm so hyped about this. Anyway, thank you all so much. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.